So our first video related to Mesopotamia and the so-called first civilization, perhaps, in all the world. Another civilization that vies for the title of first, and we really don't know which one began first, to be honest with you, is Egypt. So let's head there. Again, this is in North Africa, just above this 20th parallel, if you will. So right here, North Africa. It's often been said that Egypt is the Nile and the Nile is Egypt. And you can tell from this map that Egypt in antiquity was a country some 750 miles long and about 10 miles wide. So it's an extraordinary civilization developing along the Nile River. It developed in relative isolation from other civilizations. Unlike the Fertile Crescent, it really wasn't a place that you used to get from one place to another. It was often a destination of people because Egypt was so valued because of the Nile River, its great regularity, the great amount of agriculture that can be produced along this Nile, this river. So an amazing location in antiquity, a region that was valued. Wow, for most of the ancient world, not only did the Egyptians enjoy their country, but other civilizations, when they developed empires in the ancient world, and we're talking about the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, came to Egypt, attempted to conquer it, some of them successfully so, and some of them not so much. So a very long history because of the great abundance of agriculture that this river valley can produce. You know, of course, that Egypt, one of the most popular civilizations for study in any history class, is fascinating for its monumental building, for its connection to the pharaohs, who are these god kings who rule Egypt, who built these wonderful mausoleums for themselves. This slide, a little grainy, sorry about that. We have three of the great pyramids at Giza, the three that you see here, plus these three smaller ones. If you read your McClellan and Dorn, they'll talk to you a little bit about how these pyramids are created, and they'll also tell you that there are many more pyramids than just these. There are probably 40 or more pyramids up and down the Nile. These are called the Great Pyramids. These are the ones that are the most famous. The first pyramids built were not particularly successful. Some of the first pyramids were made out of mud brick. Some of them were, your book will talk about the bent pyramid of Egypt, where they started a particular slope up the sides and found that that slope wasn't going to work. And so you get a very strange looking pyramid, if you will. And so this is an important point in McClellan and Dorn's thesis, that even in Egypt, where we think we had some amazing things going on in the civilization, the pyramids themselves were the result of trial and error, experimentation, if you will, as to get that geometric shape. The other images we have here are up to the right here, or sorry, excuse me, up to the left, we have some school children enjoying a tour of the pyramids. Back when you could still climb on the pyramids. These days they don't let you do that. But you can see the size of these blocks if you've read your selection on pyramids in the content folder here at Blackboard for this week. You'll find that they're on average about, 2.5 tons, and a team of 20 men could move one of those 2.5 ton rocks from the quarry to the pyramid site within about 20 minutes. So the Egyptians had a good organized labor force building these pyramids. We think they took about 20 years total to build, and that's because the labor that was provided typically was provided during the flood season, when the river flooded for about 70 days every fall in the September time. We also have here one of the most intriguing elements of Egyptian architecture, and archaeology, I suppose, and that's the Sphinx. The Sphinx is a chimera, if you will, a blending of several animals meant to sort of guard this precinct. So lots of things to think about with Egypt. Most certainly art, architecture, technology, a very long-lived civilization, very interesting to us even to this day. And the reason we want to talk a little bit about this today is to see how does it fit into our discussion of science and technology in the history of the world. So, to the basics, we're going to say. So about 2600 to 31 BC, most will date Egypt and Egyptian history. There is something called the Old Kingdom era, and this is the time of pyramids and when pharaohs come to the fore and people perceive of them, or at least Pharaohs will present that they are somehow divine in leading. They're either gods themselves or somehow personally connected to the gods. The New Kingdom era, a little more recent in time, beginning about 1500 BC or so, is a time of empire building. And this is interesting for us in this course because its connections with other civilizations finally start to happen. So just as Mesopotamia had the ability to influence other societies, it's in the New Kingdom era that Egypt begins to do this as well. It's not when we're building pyramids so much, but we're doing other things that are of interest to us in this course. And in the New Kingdom era, we find evidence for lots of medical work going on. We have the Edwin Smith medical papyri that talk about surgeries, medicines, treatments. We also have some innovations in weapons technology. We don't know if it's the Egyptians who created these innovations, but they certainly do offer us the evidence to know that weapons technology is developing in the ancient world because the Egyptian evidence survives so well for us. So what about our connections to science and society? Well, just like Mesopotamia, we have extraordinary efforts at irrigation. The Egyptians don't have to work as hard as the Mesopotamians did because their river is far more predictable, far more regular in its annual flood, and we think the irrigation systems were on a much smaller scale. Still, we find that in Egyptian mathematics, we find some of the first attempts to use geometry in order to measure fields, particularly fields that have been flooded or been changed perhaps because of the Nile flood. So we find lots of examples of geometry being used. You know, of course, that the Egyptians invented a form of writing called hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphics, these are also picture writing, such as we saw in ancient Mesopotamia. The Egyptians too developed their writing in a way that goes from picture writing to what we might call a more cursive kind of writing. The Egyptians are very famous for mummification, and we think they had a very intimate knowledge of anatomy, human anatomy. This is something that becomes very important in the later periods of Egyptian history when the Greeks come into ancient Egypt, because Greek medicine, which we think has much more of a scientific approach than Egyptian medicine, Greeks coming into Egypt will get the benefit of this mummification process to learn a lot more about biology and anatomy. As we said before in your book, your McClellan and Dorn book, we'll spend some time talking to you about the Edwin Smith medical papyrus. The Egyptians had, because of their connections to mummification and anatomy, they did indeed have some detailed records on medicines, on medical treatment, and we think, perhaps not as well presented as we find with the Greeks, that the Egyptians were among the people first starting to think that illnesses might not be curses from the gods, that illnesses might have some kind of common cause that we can, as humans, detect. We already mentioned that the Egyptians are developing geometry, but we also know for sure, we have the papyri, that Egyptians are calculating pi, right? This important calculation for understanding the nature of circles. Right? So, very interesting. So we're getting some development. And most people believe that this geometry, the calculations, the mathematical calculations that we're doing really had developed in accordance with the monumental building they're doing, much like in Mesopotamia, and also the astronomy that they're engaged in. Along with that monumental building and astronomy, you should know that the Egyptians too, like the Mesopotamians, develop a calendar. Their calendar is 365 days. So again, based on observations of the heavens, mathematical calculations. And then finally, we'll talk just a little bit about some of their weapons technology, as we mentioned earlier. Just a few images. There's so much evidence that survives from ancient Egypt. It's always nice to take a little look at some of the artwork of Egypt. This image to the top just gives you a little idea of what the god Osiris was supposed to look like. And in this case, a pharaoh sort of identifying himself as Osiris. And this is from his tomb. So we're taking a look at the wall painting inside a pharaonic tomb. We get a little closer to an actual tomb itself, and you can see, again, it's rather faded in this image, but you can see the kinds of wall paintings that go alongside the tomb. Most of these relate to religious issues about burial, maybe big events in the pharaoh's life. And all of them lead us into more of a discussion about mummification. One of the elements of mummification is not only the physical process, which we'll talk just a little bit about, but also the instruction manual, if you will. And that's what the hieroglyphics in the background here talk about. They talk about the proper ritual associated with mummification, the proper spells one should say, one should do incantations for, the proper prayers to say. But the main image, of course, here is the god Anubis, the jackal-headed god, the god who helps you prepare your body for the afterlife, who helps you go to the other side. You probably know that mummification involves, after a person has died, of course, that we will do a dissection of the body and pull out those organs that, if left in the body, might lead to putrefaction, might lead to decay of the body. The organs are removed, the body flushed out. Some of the organs are preserved, as you probably know. They had some kind of special spiritual meaning to the Egyptians. But in particular, we had to remove the brain because we want the face to be as well preserved as possible. The Egyptians believed that your spirit needed to identify your corpse in order to make it to the afterlife. So, very great care of the body itself in mummification. And again, we think that part of the reason why the Egyptians were fascinated with anatomy and had actually lots of interesting information about it was because of the mummification process. This papyrus is also very famous because it shows Judgment Day in ancient Egypt, and no class that involves Egypt is complete without this image. So I don't know that it has much scientific relevance or much technological relevance, except for this wonderful scale here. This is a great scale, and the idea here is that this is Judgment Day, and if you've just passed on, and this is you, by the way, the person who's just passed on, one of the organs that we keep is your heart, and your heart is placed in a jar and then placed on a scale. And here Anubis, ever helpful, is setting the plumb, the measure that'll make sure the scale is even on both sides, right? And he's setting that. And then over here, there is a feather. There is the emblem of the Ankh, of eternal life. And Anubis is setting the weight. Here's your heart. And your heart must be lighter than a feather, or at least as light as a feather, in order for you to make it past Osiris here, who is sitting in judgment. So, I don't know about you, but when I see this image, I always think that Osiris is maybe cheating a little bit. He seems to be manipulating the plumb that sets the balance, and then he seems to be actually pulling down on the side that has the feather so that your heart will be very light. So this idea of a balance or a scale is shown here in this image. Finally, we'll take a look at this tomb painting, tomb art. This is actually etched out of the stone. This is Ramses. Ramses the Great probably lived around the 1200s BC. And we have him here in warfare. He was a great king who lived, golly, into his 70s. And he fought many battles, particularly into what we would call the Middle East and the Holy Lands, fighting against the power that now controlled the Mesopotamian River Valley. And these are the Hittites. And in this particular scene, we have him in a chariot, getting ready to shoot a bow and arrow to fire that away. And the reason I bring this forward to you is that this is a good indication to us that from this artwork that the Egyptians actually had chariots. They had the wheeled chariot, they had wheeled conveyance, and that they used most likely a composite bow and arrow because of the way this bow is bent. So that a composite being two pieces of wood tongue and grooved together to make a very strong bow, as opposed to a single bow that is just strung, a single piece of wood that is just strung. And so again, this image indicates to us from Ramses, one of his great temples, that he engaged in warfare using the chariot, using the bow and arrow, a composite bow and arrow. And it gives us one piece of evidence, and there are others that show how much metallurgy, how much work using on wheeled conveyance was actually happening in the time of the Egyptians. So a few concluding remarks, and again, I invite you to look at McClellan and Dorn for these and other ideas. So it's pretty clear that Egypt supported a large number of scribes who held very high social positions. We see this throughout all the evidence. This is a literate society, perhaps only the elite, if you will, but a literate society that saw the need to keep records, significant numbers of records, about agricultural records and the floods, about the kinds of taxes they were collecting, typically in kind, so grain being collected and other things being collected. Keeping track of treaties. Some of the first military treaties come out of Egypt at this time. So lots of reasons to keep scribes, not the least of which was to work on these monumental building projects that were going on all up and down the Nile. Huge number of building projects. Most of them in the early kingdom, the Old Kingdom period, right, were directed by pharaohs wanting to glorify their name, glorify their rule, maybe even having a religious connection that the people appreciated. So temples, monuments, burial sites. These kinds of projects required knowledge and use of engineering concepts. So we saw things like geometry being put to work, figuring out pi. Lots of trial and error on the pyramids. As we said earlier, the Egyptians developed a 365-day calendar. And again, this was based on observation, keeping track of observations in the heavens. And then finally, the Egyptians have a connection to anatomy and medicine.